Then I will share my screen. Hopefully we can get rocking and rolling. Okay, how does that look to everyone? Okay, fabulous. And truly, I would love to not talk at myself for the next however long this is. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions. Really, the whole reason why I wanted to do this talk was because, like Sonia said, I went to Emory, and for 95% of my time at Emory, I was pre-med. I applied to medical school. I took the MCAT. I took orgo and physics and did the whole 9 yards. And in about October, before I graduated, I started rethinking things and was looking for other healthcare fields that felt fulfilling in a psychosocial way, in a work-life balance way, in yes, so that's kind of how I stumbled upon genetic counseling. Honestly, it came from a lot of Googling. So my hope with this program is to spread the word a little bit to pre-health students like y'all, and hopefully create avenues where you don't just have to Google until you find genetic counseling, if genetic counseling is something that you are interested in. So let me introduce myself a little bit more. I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and then I came down to Emory and got my bachelor's degree there. And I studied MBB and dance, and I graduated in December 2019, right before the pandemic struck, and then spent that time during the pandemic and in a gap year and a bit working as a clinical research coordinator in the Center for Gene Therapy at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And interestingly enough, I worked with a physical therapy lab. So they really gave me an appreciation for other allied health professions, and I absolutely loved it. So after my time there, I moved on down to Greensboro, North Carolina, where I reside now with my partner and our 2 cats, and I'm getting my master's degree in genetic counseling as we speak. I'm finishing up my last fall semester here, so I'm graduating in May with my master's. Of course, outside of school, I like to think I have other interests. I work in disability and rare disease advocacy. I am also a puppy raiser for the Guide Dog Foundation, which I actually got started with at Emory. So I raised my first dog there, and then I just finished raising my second dog and am picking up my third dog in January. So if grad school wasn't enough, I'm adding a puppy into the mix. But I absolutely love it. And truly, North Carolina is great for getting outdoors. We're 3 hours from the beach and 2 hours from the mountains, so we get the best of both worlds. And I really enjoy trying new foods, especially sweets. So it's kind of a little bit about me. And of course, I did need to create an entire slide for the animals in my life. So over to the left is my cat Juno, and on the right is Florence, and that's my partner standing with me. And then there in the middle is our pup who we just sent up for formal training, Hayden. So she is in the process of training to become a guide dog as we speak. Okay, so now the introductions are out of the way, I wanted to give a framework for what genetic counseling is. According to the Journal of Genetic Counseling, genetic counseling is the process of helping people understand and adapt to medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. That feels like a bit of a mouthful to me, and I do appreciate sort of the different facets that this definition brings. We're talking about medicine and genetics, but we're also talking about the psychosocial pieces. When we're thinking about genetics, we're thinking about not just one patient, but an entire family oftentimes. So really, what does that mean to have a family sitting in front of you talking about their risk for inheriting a predisposition or a genetic condition? I have a couple of sort of social media resources, if you will, here at the end of the presentation. But one of the folks who I have connected with, her name is Katie Lee. She's a genetic counselor in the reproductive space, and I really liked her definition of genetic counseling. And she talks about educating patients, and not just patients, but also clinicians. Genetic counselors a lot of times are the genetics experts of their division. So they spend a lot of time talking with maternal fetal medicine doctors, with other allied health professionals, with non-genetics providers to determine and explain genetic variants and risk for an individual and their family. Genetic counselors also provide emotional support through short-term client-centered counseling, like you might think of in like talk therapy in more traditional counseling sense. And my favorite part is we empower patients to make informed healthcare decisions. So something that really drew me to the field that is unlike a lot of professions, we have an approach, which means we really lay out all of the options available to a patient and help facilitate those decisions based on their own values and beliefs and family structures. So we are not going to tell someone, hey, you need to get this genetic testing, or you shouldn't get that genetic testing. It's really based on their own education and preferences. And who are genetic counselors? Genetic counselors are allied health professionals who work in a variety of clinical and non-clinical settings to provide genetic counseling services to patients and other providers. So I have alluded to that genetic counselors can work in a number of different settings. The most common settings are in the prenatal, pediatric, and cancer spaces, but you will also find genetic counselors in the lab and other subspecialty settings like neurogenetics, cardiogenetics, pharmacogenetics. Really, I have a feeling that genetic counselors will end up in just about every specialty with time. In addition to hospitals and like private clinics, genetic counselors work at universities, they work in nonprofits and for the government. Something that I loved about genetic counseling when I was first looking into it is sort of the breadth of skills that a genetic counselor has that are transferable to many different areas. So you are not locked into one specialty or one setting. You really can make the most of the training that you get and sort of bop around if that's what feels right to you, and be able to expand what it means to be a genetic counselor. Now, genetic counselors, it's a small world, I will say that. There's only about 5,000 genetic counselors in the United States. So, we have common interests. Of course, everyone is very unique, and thankfully our field is diversifying as we speak. It's really a major initiative that I think is very important in order to best serve the diverse populations that we have. But all that being said, genetic counselors typically have an interest in genetics, of course, but also social sciences like psychology and sociology. In hindsight, majoring in neuroscience and behavioral biology was a great indicator for the kind of intersection that I was looking for in my healthcare job. Of course, genetic counselors want to help others and work in healthcare. And because genetics is such a young field, genetic counselors also have to at least have an appreciation for, if not love, lifelong learning, because there's a lot to keep up with. Genetic testing technology has exponentially changed in recent years. Testing that I offer to my patients today didn't exist 5-10 years ago. So we have a lot to learn. And I know that 5 to 10 years from now, I will be offering different genetic testing. So when we're thinking about what a typical genetic counseling session looks like, this, of course, is going to vary from specialty to specialty. So I tried to generalize it as best as I could. But usually genetic counseling sessions are 30 to 60 minutes. So we get to spend a little bit more time with patients than the maybe average healthcare provider. We can work in sort of those traditional clinic spaces or in an office similar to a counseling office, if you will. Like I mentioned before, you are often seeing not only patients, but their family members. So, I'll have those sessions where it is my patient and their children and their mom and their sister, and it's a family affair for sure. So the major components of a genetic counseling session are eliciting family history that often goes undone in healthcare. A lot of times you go to your primary care and they will say any family history, and most people will say no, but we get to spend a little bit more time parsing that out and really putting the puzzle pieces together. I think that's a big job of genetic counselors, is learning people's stories and fitting those pieces together and finishing the puzzle. Of course, we assess the pedigree once we have it in front of us for risk. We provide education about genetic diagnoses, management of those genetic conditions, and recurrence risk for offspring and other family members. We provide genetic testing options and facilitate the decision-making for what option is best for the patient, and offer support and community resources, which is something that I love as well, is we really get to connect with other providers and other communities to provide connections for families who may be 1 in 500 having this genetic condition. We can bridge those gaps so that folks have support that's outside of their medical team. And then outside of the sessions, of course, we prepare for cases, do a lot of research. There is no way that I can know about every single genetic condition off the top of my head. So knowing sort of the processes of where to find the answers is a great skill to have. We order testing and follow that testing. We consult with other providers and we call out results. So if you say you want to become a genetic counselor, what do I need to do in order to do that? First, you graduate with a bachelor's degree. There is no one type of degree that you have to have in order to apply to genetic counseling schools. A lot of times folks will have degrees in biology, chemistry, psychology, things like that. But I have met genetic counselors who got their degrees in musical theater, and really the sky's the limit as long as you take your prereqs, of course. You also want to partake in advocacy experiences, take the GRE, although that is ever changing as COVID has evolved. Many, if not most programs have done away with GRE requirement, which soapbox for another day. I love that in terms of accessibility and diversifying the field. Of course, you need to apply to your programs and interview after you've submitted your application. And then you go on to complete, it's a 2-year master's degree. Some programs are as few as 18 months, some are as many as 24 months. The program I'm in is 21 months, so right there in the middle. So that's about how long you are going to commit. And then after you graduate, you can sit for the certification exam and obtain licensure depending on what state you're practicing in. Okay. And when GC admissions committees are looking at applicants, really the main things that they're looking for is knowledge about the profession and really a commitment to knowing what you're getting yourself into, whether that be through shadowing other genetic counselors, conducting informational interviews with genetic counselors. When I was applying, it was the thick of a pandemic, so I did a lot of phone calls, a lot of Zooms, just to hear from different folks about what their day-to-day life looks like, attending webinars and presentations, which once again have become more plentiful since the pandemic. And if you're lucky and you can get your foot in the door, doing internships is also a great way. Applicants should also have some advocacy or social service experience. Really, that is whatever you want it to mean. A lot of folks will do things like crisis counseling. I worked in residence life, which has far more transferable skills than I ever could have imagined. And just volunteering in your community, learning from people who are different from you, connecting with people who are different from you, and really being a servant to others. And then applications for genetic counseling school are typically due in December or January of each year. And that includes a personal statement, GRE scores, prerequisite course grades, your GPA, and usually an average of 3 letters of recommendation. I also realized my video went away and I don't know why. So I'll just keep trucking and hopefully it'll come back at some point. Oh, hello, there I am. Okay, great. Okay, so what are the prerequisites in terms of academics? A 3.0 GPA or higher is recommended, though it's not a hard and fast rule. Again, the GRE is phasing out, I would say, but you should have about a 50th percentile on the GRE or more. And in terms of undergraduate coursework, there is no common app for genetic counseling schools, so you will apply to each school individually. I hope that changes in the near future because it would make everyone's life easier, especially the applicants' lives. But at this point, the coursework may differ depending on what program you're applying to. For UNCG, for example, their prerequisites are in genetics, statistics, biochemistry with at least 1 semester of organic chemistry. Other programs have prereqs in embryology and psychology. So while most pre-health majors, I would say, cover a lot of those, things like a genetics class or an embryology class may be something you tack on at the end or during the summer before you even go into the program is an option for a lot of places too. So it's not like you have to have this all tied up in a bow when you apply, but something to keep in mind. So once you have submitted your applications, the interviews typically take place in February to April. Thankfully, because of COVID, those have all gone virtual. And I imagine they'll stay virtual for accessibility reasons. Not too long ago, folks were flying all over the country to apply to these programs. There's only 54 programs in the United States right now, which is not as many as you might think. So you really were putting in the miles to get those interviews done. And then genetic counseling schools actually operate on a match system. So similar to a physician residency match, you rank the programs that you interviewed at, and then those programs also rank their applicants, and an algorithm in late April spits out your results and you are matched to a program. So you're not necessarily given offers to multiple programs. You will be matched with a program in late April. And in terms of the admission statistics, about 2,000 people every year register for the match, and half of those will receive at least one interview. And then about half of those individuals will receive an offer for a genetic counseling school. So that is growing and changing. More programs are being accredited every year, so more spots are becoming available. I know at our program, we went up from having 7 spots in each cohort to 9. So cohorts are also growing. So the space is growing, but so are the applicants. And I do want to talk a little bit about what it means to be in genetic counseling school. Of course, I can only talk about my experience at UNCG, so I will be more specific to them, but everyone's accredited by the same body, so you'll get approximately the same education no matter where you go. We have coursework in things like medical genetics, counseling theory, peer supervision, ethics, research methods, and far more. For us at UNCG, we most of our classes are cohort only classes. So it is me and my 6 classmates, definitely a small tight knit group that you get to know very well. Some programs are bigger, some are smaller. I think the largest program I can think of has 24 students in a cohort. So that gives you an idea, but definitely smaller class size regardless. And then at UNCG, we also have joint classes with the other cohort. So we have a psychosocial seminar that we have with our first years every week, which is a great place to get other perspectives and connect with the first years. At some institutions, you take coursework with PhD students and med students and PA students. So it really just depends on what program you go to, how integrated your class is into other courses. We have community and volunteer experiences built into our curriculum. So things like attending the buddy walk for Down syndrome awareness. We do that every year. We have a class called Genetic Counseling in the Community where we get paired up with a family who's affected by a genetic condition, and we spend time with them and live their lives with them. And it is a really great way to gain that perspective outside of the medical setting. We also volunteer with an organization called Sibs Shops, which is a support organization for siblings of individuals with genetic conditions, and we help facilitate those meetings as well. In terms of clinical rotations, this definitely differs depending on what program you're in. For us, our rotations begin in the second year. Some programs rotations begin in the first year. For us, we have observations and sort of mini clinical experiences in the first year, but in the second year, we have 5 7-week rotations across the state of North Carolina. 3 are in those main categories of genetic counseling and cancer, peds, and prenatal. So I have had rotations at Cone, which is our local community hospital. I've also had rotations at Duke and UNC Chapel Hill. I'm heading into a remote rotation for a education and outreach company. So really the options are endless. You can also do laboratory rotations and variant curation. So you can also have non-clinical rotations as well. We also have a capstone project, which is reminiscent of a thesis. And we choose our topics at around this time in the first year, and then we hold on to those topics for about 1.5 years and really grow them into research projects. So that is part of the requirement to graduate with master's, and of course, other extracurricular activities. I am a report writer for the Undiagnosed Disease Network at Duke. I'm a puppy raiser. We do an adult tennis league, which comes with beer at the end, which makes the running around worth it to me. Exploring the surrounding cities. I worked part-time in my first year. I worked at a veterinary hospital, so used a different corner of my brain, but definitely a good way to get out of the school mindset sometimes. And then our program and a lot of programs have a federally funded fellowship called the Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Fellowship, which I did through UNC Chapel Hill last year. In terms of what a career in genetic counseling looks like, the typical starting salary for a full-time new grad is $75,000 a year. That is also growing. 10 years ago, it was closer to $50,000 a year. So thankfully, the value of genetic counselors is being appreciated more. So it's being reflected in salaries. It is a really rapidly growing field as genetic testing gets cheaper. Honestly, testing 20 years ago was thousands of dollars, and now it's a couple hundred, if that. So as testing gets cheaper and we know more about genetics, the need for genetics professionals is growing. So there's no shortage of jobs if this is a field that you are interested in, and job security is always a good thing. About 50% of genetic counselors work in direct patient care, 25% will work in non-direct care, and the last 25 will work in sort of mixed settings. So in the lab and working in curation and report writing and things like that. And with COVID, the variety of service delivery models we have has really expanded, whether that be seeing patients in person or virtually through telehealth. That has also been a really fast growing component of genetic counseling. And I would be remiss to not reflect on all of the other roles that genetic counselors can have. Like I said, there are really so many transferable skills in genetic counseling. Some folks will serve as medical science liaisons and travel all over the country. Others work in higher education, educating the next generation of genetic counselors. You'll see genetic counselors in research, working in nonprofits, working in public policy and public health. It's a really big growing area. Some programs will even have combined MPH and master's degrees. You can find genetic counselors in sperm and egg banks, and also working for direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. And I just saw a job posting for a genetic counselor at Embark, the dog DNA company. So, hey, you can really find genetic counselors everywhere. Sounds like a great gig to me. You're allowed to bring your dog to work, so I wouldn't be mad at that. Okay, so I kind of had a pause built in here for questions about genetic counseling school, the application process. If there's anything I can answer there. On the back end of this presentation, I have just some like examples and just nerdy genetics questions. So, but I thought I would let y'all ask any questions that you have now.
Yeah, I do have some. Oh, sorry. Katie, you can go ahead.
No, you can go first. I need to flesh out my question. You go for it.
Okay, sounds good. So I think my question would be like you previously stated that you were pre-health and you majored in MBB, but then like how did you get interested? You said you also stated that you Googled a lot of information. Is that what kind of like motivated you to go into this field, or is it the courses work or the clinical research or research lab, or just like any opportunities that you attended really solidify your interest in like genetic counseling and made you decide that, oh, this is the field that I want to go into?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I will say, maybe cold feet is the right word about medical school. Was definitely had that sort of unsettling feeling as I was applying, and I couldn't quite name what it was. So that's sort of when I started just doing some like Googling, doing some searching around. And actually at that time, I think it was like a week later at Emory, there was a genetic counseling camp, if you will, that was just an all-day seminar of different genetic counselors coming in from different specialties talking about their roles. And I believe they still do that on an annual basis in the October timeframe. So thankfully, that kind of landed in my lap right when I was seriously considering moving away from going to medical school. And so I attended that event, and I just felt really at home in the philosophy that genetic counselors have, in sort of the culture of care that genetic counselors have. Self-disclosure, I have a disability, and that very much paints the way I move through the world. And I think genetic counselors, because of the way we are trained, we are well poised to support other genetic counselors with disabilities, genetic counselors from all kinds of backgrounds. So I just felt very at home in that, and felt like I would be able to help patients see themselves in me and have a more therapeutic alliance with patients rather than a clinical transactional sort of relationship. So I think that was ultimately what deciphered genetic counseling for me from other healthcare fields.
Thank you.
Good question.
I kind of have two questions, if that's okay. You had mentioned that you had graduated with the NBB major. That's something I'm extremely interested in, and I'm currently on that track to be a neuroscience and behavioral biology major. So I thought it was really fun that you were as well. I didn't know with that background if you had any kind of insight into the specific neuroscience specialization for genetic counselors. Is that a specialty that a lot of people go into? If there is, does that seem like a large community? Does that seem like a fast growing community? Or is that not a typical specialty? I know you had mentioned prenatal and cancer and others being some of the top ones, but like, what do you see for neuroscience specific genetic counseling? Like, what does that look like? Is that a kind of corner of this specific career that is an option and a fast growing alternative?
Yeah, I would say it is definitely in the fast growing category. A lot of the subspecialties like cardiogenetics, like neurogenetics, are pretty small right now, but it is definitely an area where providers need help in knowing the genetics of neurological conditions, of epilepsy, of adult onset conditions like Huntington disease and things like that. So, for example, I know that UNC Chapel Hill, they just hired on a couple of genetic counselors last year for the first time, and they're already hiring more. So, I don't have exact numbers. It's definitely a smaller subset, but it is an area that is being nurtured. It's available as a rotation in a lot of programs. So if that is a specialty that you're interested in, I think that's a great place to ask about when you are looking into programs to see if a neurogenetics rotation is an option. But it is definitely growing. It's something that I'm also interested in. Of course, we have had multiple students in recent history go on to be neurogenetic counselors specifically right out of grad school. So I think not too long ago, a lot of folks would start in cancer, prenatal, or pediatric, and then sort of branch out into subspecialty. But now subspecialties are sort of on the table right out the gate. So I think it's going to be a really exciting place to be a genetic counselor for sure, and a place where you can have a lot of autonomy and be the experts and be sort of your own boss when it comes to your professional expertise. So
Yeah, that sounds amazing, and that's really great to hear. And I guess I was also just kind of interested in how, like, could you talk a little bit more about like how genetic counselors are able to outsource and work with general care teams? Like, is this something, like, how does it like, what's the relationship like between being a genetic counselor and working with general care doctors? I imagine with cancer, it's probably a lot of teamwork and outsourcing with hospitals. What does it look like, kind of like being able to work with other specialties and be a part of a general care team while not necessarily working in a hospital?
yeah, so tell me if I'm getting your question right. Thinking about more a primary care setting, is that what you're talking about?
I guess I'm just interested as like, I know that there's a lot of motivations for why someone would see a genetic counselor, and just, I guess, the ways in which they're able, like a genetic counselor would be able to help them make these informed care decisions. That seems very attractive. But when they go and take these decisions to an actual care setting, how much is the genetic counselor involved in that, and like helping them make these informed decisions, and then maybe relaying that back to a primary care team, or
Okay.
that sort of thing, I guess, if that makes
good
sense.
question. I think so primarily how the structure works is we get a lot of referrals from specialty doctors, like oncologists, like gynecologists, in the cancer setting, for example. That, they're the ones who are looking, one of the few who are looking and saying, oh, your mom had breast cancer at 40, you should go see a genetic counselor, and they make the referral, and then we live typically under an oncology department, but work pretty independently to actually facilitate that decision-making and order the testing and call out those results. And then we relay those results back to the referring physician to sort of integrate that information into their care. Increasingly, genetic counselors are working in multidisciplinary settings. So they're working with not only geneticists and, sort of these primary referral sites that we think of, but also social workers and physical and occupational therapists and other providers. I think that structure is ever evolving. Genetic counselors at this point don't have licensure in every state, which means we need to practice under a ordering physician for the most part, unless you are practicing in a licensed state. North Carolina is not a licensed state at this point, though we are working on it. So if you want to look into that licensure and send an email to your legislator, I would appreciate that. That's a different aside, but so we work under an ordering provider, although the level of autonomy within any given clinic really depends. In pediatric settings, we work very closely with geneticists because geneticists are the ones who are performing physical exams on the patients. We cannot do physical exams, but in a cancer setting, we technically order under oncologists, but we do not have to directly interact with them. So it's kind of striking a balance between that autonomy and working within a team. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think the independence portion that you spoke to is also really helpful, just understanding like the dependence between different parties. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's confusing because we always joke in genetics, the answer is it depends. So I feel like this is another example of it depends, but we're getting there. It's still a very young field. Honestly, the first genetic counselor was trained in 1970, which is not all that long ago. So we are constantly evolving for sure. Any other questions before I jump to the next?
I do have a quick one. So you talked about like the different types of work that genetic counselors do. Would you mind sharing like what your day look like in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it definitely depends on what specialty you are working in. I will give cancer as an example because that's the rotation that I just finished up. At my specific site, we had prep time for half of every day. So that means prepping for cases, reviewing the medical records for our upcoming patients, and determining testing eligibility if we can find that information from the chart. And then it also means we're calling out results and following up on tubes of blood that are traveling across the country to the genetic testing lab in California, and calling out referrals, taking in referrals. Those kinds of things happen during our administrative time. And then we see patients on the other half of the day, and we will typically see 3 to 4 patients every day. I really like that setup because we get to spend ample time with each patient and make sure that we're not rushing anyone through. And again, taking that pedigree, assessing the family history, discussing testing options, and really facilitating that decision. So if they want to get their blood drawn today, that's what we do. And we help get them to the lab and get that blood drawn and sent out and mailed out. And we kind of rinse and repeat. We also do things like tumor boards where we sit with the other oncologists and determine who of new patients are eligible for genetic testing based on national guidelines. So that's a place where we get to interact with PAs and NPs and physicians. we also do a lot of continuing education to keep up with things that is sort of built into the day-to-day life as well. And of course, supervision and mentorship and interacting with the rest of the genetic counseling team too. Like I said, it really differs depending on what specialty you're in. Some folks will see 9 patients a day. Some folks will have specific clinics. So in like the pediatric setting, you may have a clinic day that happens once a month where you only see patients who have Down syndrome, or 22q deletion syndrome, things like that, that are more specialized to certain diagnoses. So I would say for the most part, no 2 days look alike, which is nice. You are always on your toes and you're always learning, and you're not going to get stuck in a rut for sure.
Yeah, that sounds amazing because you mentioned that a lot of transferable skills are used and you also learn a lot. I definitely love that aspect. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I would agree. It's you know, there's you do not have to sit in one place. You can be a prenatal genetic counselor for 10 years and then switch it up and do cancer. And that is an easy enough jump to make, or start working in public policy. Really, the choices are endless. Any other questions? Okay, cool. I know we also started late, so I like want to be cognizant of time. I'm not sure what y'all have going on after this because it is technically 6 o'clock. Really, the next couple things that I had were just like more examples and direct education about some genetics concepts. So I'm happy to go through those. I'm also happy to let y'all get on with your night. So I'm happy to sort of go with whatever y'all's heart's desire. If you have no preference, I can also keep trugging, whatever works.
I'm sorry, but I think I'll have to leave, but it's super nice to know more about this career option. And thank you so much for sharing all these like useful information. Thank you
Absolutely.
all.
And before you go, if I could
Mhm.
so kindly go through and ask you if you wouldn't mind finding a lot of transitions going on here. Scanning this QR code, it's just like a little feedback survey that will take like 2 minutes, just so
Sure.
that I can apply that feedback and do better or keep doing what I'm doing.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. I'll quickly scan it.
Okay, fabulous. Yeah, thank you so much. It was so nice meeting you.
It was nice to meet you.
Kate, how you doing?
I'm good. I don't know, I guess I just had a couple more questions.
Absolutely. I'm also cool with that.
Um, I'm like a first year student, so I'm pretty new in this process. I guess I'm getting your cold feet 4 years earlier, um, which is a blessing and a curse, but I guess I'm just trying to figure out for a lot of the interests. I think neuroscience is one, genetics is one. What are some of these options?
Yeah.
And Emory had like a little genetic count, like they have like a team here, and I got
Yeah.
to speak with some of them, and it seemed interesting. I guess so. Like my level of knowledge is probably quite low on a lot of this stuff, so like I appreciate you being patient with stuff. But I guess like just in general, I was looking at like what would be the difference between this and like being a geneticist? Like what is the difference? Because in my mind they seemed very similar, and I wish I had a better, broader knowledge to go into some of this, but I guess as simple as the question might be, like just in principle, geneticists versus genetic counselors, like what is the difference primarily?
Yeah, it's a great question. You are not alone in trying to sort of parse out what the roles are. That's part of why genetic counselors don't have licensure federally, because we're trying to figure out does a licensed genetic counselor look like a geneticist? The short answer is no, it does not. I think the biggest thing is geneticists, they are ultimately the ones who are doing the physical exam. They are the ones who are performing dysmorphology assessments and have a more phenotype driven lens, where genetic counselors, we do receive training in dysmorphology and phenotype, of course, because that's how we know what genetic conditions are. But we are not going to go and say, oh, this patient had XYZ, that means they have this syndrome. We're more test driven in that way, that we know what kind of testing that we need to order in order to find the answer. And then we kind of work backwards from there. Of course, geneticists have to go to more school, and they spend more money to do that school. That was definitely a motivating factor to me. Bluntly, genetic counselors are not required to do the 80-hour work weeks in residency and things like that. So again, that was something that was appealing to me. I think depending on the setting you're in, genetic counselors can have a lot of autonomy, but ultimately you cannot be entirely autonomous if you are working in a state that does not have licensure. So I know that's kind of a non-answer and I apologize for that, but I hope that's helpful. I think just the extent of training, it's funny because, the master's degree has existed this entire time. When we started off as genetic counselors, as just in the prenatal setting, as just, thinking about like biochemical screening. Now we have actual genetic testing, and we have far more advanced ultrasound technology, and we truly, the amount of information that we need to learn in 2 years has exponentially grown since the beginning of the field. So, there's always talk of whether or not genetic counselors need more time to do training. There's a lot of learning on the job because you cannot possibly learn everything in 2 years. But I think genetic counselors are also more intentionally trained in the counseling, in the psychosocial piece, in how to support someone in crisis when they are told, hey, here's this diagnosis that not only affects you, but it affects your parents and your siblings and your kids. What does that mean? And how can we support you in a longer term? So I think that's something that I love about it, is we have the time to ask those questions and not just sort of look through the medical lens, through the diagnosis lens. We have a more person-centered approach a lot of times. I like to think that's changing in other healthcare professions too, but something that I think genetic counselors are on the forefront of.
Yeah, and that's something that's definitely very attractive to me, like the long-term patient care, I guess, or just having more of a patient relationship. Because I think a common misconception, like at this point in understanding medical careers, like as a first year, is like, oh, as a doctor, like you know all your patients, but really you're just going through your patients so quickly. So having that long-term relationship is really interesting to me. But on like usually when there is a diagnosis, how long does the genetic counselor stay in the picture for their care plan? And since it is affecting more than just one person, like how involved are they, and how long term is the relationship with some of these patients? With when you say 3 to 4 patients a day, is there a lot of repeat? Do you see a lot of the same people, or is there a lot of turnover in how quickly you outsource to other medical professionals, or how much you follow up?
Great question. And the answer is it depends. In the, of course, prenatal setting, for example, you're working with a pregnant person, right? So generally speaking, that is on a more short-term time frame. You, of course, can see someone who has a known balanced translocation, and every time they go to have a child, they come to you. So you get to see them with every pregnancy and follow them through every pregnancy. Sometimes you have patients who are just coming in because they want carrier screening, and that's sometimes sort of a one and done sort of thing. So I think, a lot of times it's very patient led in how connected they want to be with their genetic counselor and what kind of relationship they want from their genetic counselor. A lot of people aren't used to the kind of patient relationship that genetic counselors can provide, and they kind of get this deer in the headlights of like, oh, like we get to have a conversation about this. They like literally, I have had patients time and time again say, well, like, but what would you do? Like, but like, what is the plan? And I get to say, I don't get to make that decision for you. We can sit and talk about all the options. But I think, sometimes that means that folks aren't going to be very likely to stay in touch. In a pediatric setting, we see a lot of those patients once every 6 months to once a year. To check in. Genetics and genetic counseling tends to be the quarterback of care coordination for those patients. So we make sure that they're getting their annual ultrasounds and they're seeing their physical therapist regularly and they're getting their labs every year. So we kind of tend to be home base in the pediatric setting. And then in things like cancer, you're right, we may see a patient for pre-test counseling and post-test counseling, but then we see their sister and then we see their mom and then we see their other sister. So it's not necessarily the same patient over a long period of time, but we really get to know the whole family and build connections that way. So it's really what you make it and what the patients make it, but I would say that's typically for those respective specialties, kind of how the relationships look.
Got it. That totally answers my question, and I see how you say it's very much dependent. It like all depends on the situation and the patient and a thousand different things, but that's nice that it leaves a lot of variation in the day to day, and it doesn't seem like it's too monotonous, which also sounds nice. So
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's all the questions I have. I really appreciate you answering them and talking through it. Yeah.
For sure. Well, I'm happy to do it. And I can pull up my screen again because you're welcome to take down my contact information if anything else comes up. I know that I'm like a marinator and things will come up like 3 hours from now and be like, oh, we should have talked.
I'm also that person, so I appreciate it.
Good. So let me back on up. We also, my program has, and really every program has like social media. So that's a great way to learn more as well. We don't just like advertise our program. We also talk genetics and talk genetic counseling. So that's a good place to look too. I'm also happy to pass these slides on to Sonia if it's helpful for other folks to take a look
here.
Where is my contact? There it is. Yes, and the UNCG like program has a general email where you can contact our program director. She can forward along questions to specific students who may be best to answer them. Of course, at the end of the day, my perspective is my perspective. So we are all more than happy to connect with prospective students. I know you're early in the process, but I think that's a good place to be to learn as much as you can and make an informed decision. I am glad that you're here in your first year and not this time in your last year. So you're the reason why I'm doing this.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Of course. And did you get a chance to snag that?
Yeah, the QR code, I was able to pull it up, so I just have it on. I'll get that done in the near future. But
perfect. I appreciate that. Yeah, it should only take a couple minutes. And here's the other social media resources that I was talking about: Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all the things. The National Society of Genetic Counselors also has a Find a Genetic Counselor tool where it will list every genetic counselor who is open to student contact. So if there's folks in your area that you can touch base with, I think that's a really good place to start too, if you want to learn more
Wow.
from them and their practice.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that sounds really interesting.
So nice. So you don't have to like go hunting for them.
Yeah.
For sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, I have to run.
Yes.
But I really appreciate it. Also, thank you, Sonia. Yeah. And yeah,
you.
thank you again. This is really helpful.
Thanks for
I'm so
coming.
glad. Thanks for
Okay.
joining.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Have a good night, you guys. Thank you so much.
Bye now.